This program is about unsolved mysteries. Whenever possible, the actual family members and police officials have participated in recreating the events. What you're about to see is not a news broadcast.
Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering thematic walking tours in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director of the company, and thank you for spending a little bit of your day today with us. Growing up, one of my favorite television programs was Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack.
Join me. You may be able to help solve a mystery.
And one of the episodes I clearly still remember to this day was about a man who hijacked an airplane, then parachuted from the plane midair with a large sum of money that he managed to get as ransom, and the hijacker, his parachute, really nothing, or virtually nothing, of the hijacker was ever found. And it remains the only unsolved skyjacking case in U.S. history. Now, the reason I thought this would be a great topic for today's show is that recently, in fact on July 12th, 2016, the FBI announced they were actually closing the case. And I would like to read the statement to you from the FBI. The title is Update on Investigation of 1971 Hijacking by D.B. Cooper. Following one of the longest and most extensive investigations in our history, on July 8th, 2016, the FBI redirected resources allocated to the D.B. Cooper case in order to focus on other investigative priorities. During the course of the 45-year investigation, the FBI has exhaustively reviewed all credible leads, coordinated between multiple field offices to conduct searches, collected all available evidence, and interviewed all identified witnesses. Over the years, the FBI has applied numerous new and innovative investigative techniques, as well as examined countless items at the FBI laboratory. Evidence obtained during the course of the investigation will now be preserved for historical purposes at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The mystery surrounding the hijacking of Northwest Airlines flight in 1971 by a still unknown individual resulted in significant international attention and a decades-long manhunt. Although the FBI appreciated the immense number of tips provided by members of the public, none to date have resulted in a definitive identification of the hijacker. The tips have conveyed multiple plausible theories, descriptive information about individuals potentially matching the hijacker, and anecdotes, to include counts of sudden, unexplained wealth. In order to solve the case, the FBI must prove culpability beyond a reasonable doubt, and unfortunately, none of the well-meaning tips or applications of new investigative technology have yielded the necessary proof. Every time the FBI assesses individual tips for the case, investigative resources and manpower are diverted from programs that are more urgently needed. Although the FBI will no longer actively investigate this case, should specific physical evidence emerge related specifically to the parachutes or the money taken by the hijacker, individuals with those materials are asked to contact their local FBI field office. Or quite simply, it seems that D.B. Cooper may have committed the perfect crime.
Come fly with me, let's fly away. If you can use some exotic booze.
In today's show, we're going to look at the case in a little more detail, the events on that day, and the search that followed. A little bit of the evidence, because there's not much, as well as some of the eyewitness testimony, and of course, a few of the possible suspects that still remain. Before we get into that, obviously, with summer upon us now, beautiful evenings, a great time to join us for a walking tour in Kingston, Ottawa, or Toronto. We also have special events going this month in all three cities: Haunted Walk experiences at Mackenzie House in Toronto, Upper Canada Village in Morrisburg, Ontario, and the Mackenzie King Estate in Gatineau Park. If you haven't joined us yet this summer, please, we'd love to see you out on tour. All the information about our tours and special events can be found on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com.
'Cause I'm leaving on a jet plane. I don't know when I'll be back again. Oh, babe, I hate to go.
November 24th, 1971 was the day before Thanksgiving. A neatly dressed man in a suit and tie approached the ticket counter for Northwest Airlines at the Portland International Airport. He purchased a one-way ticket for a flight to Seattle for $20 cash. When he purchased his ticket, he gave his name as Dan Cooper. Due to an error of communication between the FBI and reporters, his name was reported in the press as D.B. Cooper, and this is the name which is actually stuck. But the name he actually signed for for his ticket was Dan Cooper. Now, the reason Dan Cooper is so important is that there was a Franco-Belgian comic about a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot named Dan Cooper. That was the name of the comic series. Now, what's interesting about this series is it was only ever available in French, which leads some speculation that this comic book character, who was known to parachute out of planes, that perhaps D.B. Cooper may have spent some time in Europe, perhaps a serviceman of some sort. But really interesting that he chose the name Dan Cooper. During the conversation with the ticket agent, he's also reported as asking a very particular question about the aircraft for the flight. He asked, "That's a 727, right?" Now, Boeing's 727 was a fairly new aircraft at the time, and its most unique feature was that at the aft or the rear of the plane, there was a set of stairs that could be put down. At the time, stairs were often brought in on, you remember those carts kind of things, little trucks with the stairs would go up. The 727 essentially had its own staircase, which made these portable stairs somewhat unnecessary. Eyewitnesses report he acted like any other businessman waiting for his flight, waiting to go home for the holiday weekend, and they describe him staring out the window, enjoying a drink while in the lounge. When he boarded the plane, he took his seat near the rear of the aircraft, along with the other 36 passengers on the flight and the 6 Northwest crew members. Not long after takeoff, D.B. Cooper handed one of the flight attendants a note inside an envelope. Now, this particular flight attendant was a former beauty queen, and apparently she was fairly used to getting notes from gentlemen on flights, so she didn't really think much about it when she received it and threw it in her bag, her purse, unopened. A few minutes later, D.B. Cooper told her, "Miss, I think you better have a look at that note." The hijacker did take this note back, so we don't have it as firm evidence, but from the eyewitnesses, they reported reading, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." The flight attendant quickly sat down beside him, at which point he opened up his briefcase to reveal several red cylinders that the flight attendant took to be dynamite. D.B. Cooper's demands included 4 parachutes, 2 main, which go on your back, and 2 reserves, which would go on your front, and $200,000 in cash, which today would be equal to about $1.1 million. He instructed the plane to circle Puget Sound until the cash and chutes were ready at the Seattle airport. When his demands were met, he promised to release all of the passengers. In retrospect, this was a very cunning way to pass information to the cockpit, by using the stewardess. That way he never spoke directly to any of the pilots or to the FBI, who later came on the line. Everything was done through this intermediary. And I'd like to play for you now the actual call from the airliner into the tower reporting that they were being hijacked.
Tower, this is 305. Passenger advises he's hijacking aircraft. Has bomb in briefcase, over. Passengers requesting $200,000 and 4 parachutes by 5 p.m. in Seattle.
The flight crew asked if it would be all right if they could move the other passengers, who at this point were unaware that the plane was being hijacked, if they could move them to the front of the plane away from D.B. Cooper. They were concerned that passengers, if they realized what was happening, might try to take matters into their own hands, which would be exceptionally dangerous. As the plane was circling above Washington State, one of the flight attendants asked him if he had a grudge, particularly against Northwest. And he's reported as responding, "I don't have a grudge against your airline, miss. I just have a grudge." They report that throughout the hijacking, Cooper acted like a gentleman. One of the flight attendants says he was never cruel or nasty. He was thoughtful and calm.
He was not nervous. He seemed rather nice, other than he wanted certain things to be done.
Upon being informed of the situation, Northwest's president authorized payment of the ransom and issued instructions to his staff aboard the plane to fully cooperate with D.B. Cooper. 10,000 unmarked $20 bills were then sourced from a variety of banks in Seattle, with the FBI photographing each one of them. When the chutes and the money were ready to go, word was passed to the plane, at which point D.B. Cooper ordered the plane to land. Cooper ordered that all the window shades be drawn so that snipers could not get a clear view of him. One of the flight attendants was then sent out of the plane to receive the money and the chutes. And when those were back on board, the passengers were released. Cooper then outlined his flight plan to the crew, with the instruction they were to fly a course to Mexico City, which is a convenient course for someone to take looking to skydive out of a plane, as there was plenty of good landing zones that could be used. He also had some very specific instructions, which lead many investigators to believe that he had some aeronautical knowledge of some sort. Either he was a pilot, a technician who worked on planes, perhaps a cargo loader, something to that degree, because he specifically asked that the plane fly at its minimum flight speed without stalling, which is about 200 miles an hour. He also demanded the plane fly at a very low altitude of 10,000 feet, and the landing gear was to remain deployed the entire time. The other very interesting demand he had was that the cabin itself remain unpressurized, and many theorized this was to ease his ability to open the stairs mid-flight. Before taking off, Cooper was seen putting on one of the main parachutes, and the witnesses described like he was very familiar with it, again leading some credence to that he must have had some knowledge or some experience with parachuting. As the plane took off, 2 F-16s were scrambled from nearby McCord Air Force Base and positioned themselves above and below the plane so that Cooper could not see them. However, the problem was the plane was going so slowly that the jet fighters kind of had to do sweeping circular motions. And in doing this, in a dark night, with some storm, with some rain, they never actually saw D.B. Cooper jump from the aircraft. 20 minutes into the flight, a warning light came on in the cockpit, indicating that the aft door was now open. 10 minutes after that, the plane suddenly lurched upwards, and they believe that it was at that point that the stairs went from just being opened to being fully extended all the way, and D.B. Cooper made his jump into the darkness. When the plane landed in Reno, Nevada for a scheduled fuel stop, D.B. Cooper was gone.
We're looking for the briefcase now, but so far found nothing. Over. Sir, be advised our passenger took leave of us somewhere between here and Seattle.
And as far as we know, no one has seen him since. At this point, 2 searches began. One, a search of the aircraft to see what they could discover about who this hijacker may have been and where they may be on their way to now. And also a search of the area they believed the hijacker parachuted into. On the plane itself, the FBI recovered 66 unidentified latent fingerprints, hair samples from the headrest of the seat he sat in, and the 2 parachutes he left behind. None of the fingerprints provided any matches to anyone in the FBI system. One of the first things the FBI did as well was look up to see if there was anybody named D.B. Cooper in Portland, where the flight originated from, and in fact there was a petty criminal from Portland named D.B. Cooper, but on examination, he did not fit the physical description, quickly ruled out as a suspect. And due to the conditions of Cooper's demands, such as the flight speed and the altitude, as well as the unknown elements, such as how long he was in freefall before opening his chute, if he did at all, it made it quite difficult to determine what area to search. Something I'm sure the FBI regrets in retrospect is they did not put any tracking device of any sort into any of the parachutes. What we do know is that it would have been a very rough ride for D.B. Cooper. The temperature at the altitude when he jumped was minus 5 degrees Celsius, and it was raining. Now, reports of this vary to just a light rain, to some people in the area saying it was one of the worst storms they had of the year. The pilots of the flight also report it was just in general a bumpy ride for them trying to fly this course that D.B. Cooper had instructed. There is some confusion about when the first ground search began, but it seems, at the very minimum, Cooper had about an 11-hour head start from the time he jumped out of the plane to the first organized search began. But many believe that the time frame was even longer, giving Cooper somewhere a 36 to 40-hour head start. The instruction the searchers were given were very simple and very clear. Look for either a parachute or a hole in the ground. As the ground search began, an aerial search took place at the same time, also following these basic conditions. Look for any sign of a parachute, damaged trees, anything along those lines where a man may have fallen from the sky. The local search of the area turned up nothing and was discontinued after 7 days. For a few weeks later, the FBI continued to fly some reconnaissance flights, but again, no great leads and no sign of Cooper was ever discovered. As it was now into December, everything was kind of put on hold again until the spring thaw. So in the spring of 1972, a massive search went underway, one of the largest in U.S. history, which included 200 soldiers from Fort Lewis, National Guardsmen, civilian volunteers, and even a submarine was brought in to search a nearby lake. 2 women working as part of the search crew thought they had made a major discovery when they came across a skeleton in an abandoned structure out in the woods. Sadly, the remains were identified as a local teenager who had been abducted and murdered several weeks before. With the hundreds of searchers involved on the ground and in the air, and the countless enthusiasts who came out searching for clues, as this was a major news story at the time, it is miraculous that nothing was found. At least not then. In the meantime, while they were searching, the FBI provided serial numbers for all the bills to financial institutions, racetracks, and other businesses that would deal with large sums of cash. Northwest offered a 15% reward for any money found. In 1972, the serial numbers were made public, and 2 men actually made a bunch of counterfeit bills that they used to defraud a Newsweek reporter out of $30,000, as they were using it as proof that they knew who D.B. Cooper was and promised an exclusive interview. Despite the offers of rewards and other incentives, no one came forward with other bills. Interesting discoveries were made in 1978. Placard on how to deploy the aft stairs of a 727 was found in the search area. And reports do indicate that the Boeing 727 that landed in Reno, the D.B. Cooper hijacked, that placard was missing. That was cataloged, so it does seem that was from the flight. In 1980, a 9-year-old boy found 3 stacks of the ransom cash. It was significantly disintegrated, but still bound together by rubber bands. He was building a campfire near the Columbia River, playing with the sand, when he found the stacks of money. The FBI has confirmed that those bills were part of the ransom, and they were arranged in the same order as to when they were given to Cooper. Initial statements by the investigators were based on the concept that these bills must have washed into the Columbia River from one of its tributaries. The bills had been matted together and disintegrated in kind of a roundish fashion, all of this indicating they weren't buried but must have washed to that location. However, there are some pretty significant problems with that theory. It doesn't explain why 10 bills were missing from one of the stacks, nor why the 3 packs would have remained together, but separate from all of the rest of the money involved in the case. Also, it's unlikely that the rubber bands themselves would have survived almost 10 years floating down the rivers and being exposed to the elements. So questions do arise. Did he drop the money before exiting the aircraft on the stairs? Did some of the money slip away from him? Did someone bring the money to that location after the search, which included that area, had been concluded? Could a wild animal have been involved and dragged the money somewhere? Or did D.B. Cooper realize that he could never actually use that money, as it had been marked, and decided to simply dump it? In 1981, a human skull was found along the same riverbed where these stacks were found by the 8-year-old boy, but the skull was determined to belong to a woman, so that lead really ended up going nowhere. In 1986, with the case still unsolved, the bills were divided up equally between the 8-year-old boy and Northwest's insurer, who really are the one who's ended up paying for the ransom. As well, some of the bills were kept by the FBI. To date, none of the other 9,710 remaining bills have turned up anywhere in the world. It is quite simply like they have disappeared. One of the fundamental questions in the case is whether D.B. Cooper could have survived jumping out of the airplane. Can you parachute out of a 727 and live? At first, the FBI seemed to be of the opinion that it was extremely unlikely that he successfully parachuted to the ground. One of the big questions seems to be whether he was smart enough to deploy the parachute on the stairs before actually jumping and letting kind of the wind passing by take the parachute and him out. It'd be much more difficult, apparently, if he just jumped out of the aircraft and then pulled the chute. But it's really difficult to get a handle on his level of expertise in parachuting. And that's because he did seem to be able to put on the chutes quite easily. He obviously had some knowledge of the aircraft and how it was to operate. But the one part that's kind of unsettling is that the reserve chute he used, the one on his front of his body, was actually a dummy chute that was sewn shut, used for training purposes. So if he had needed to use that reserve chute, which he took with him, it would not have worked. In 1972, the year following Cooper's attempt, there were several copycat attempts using basically the same setup. And we know at least 5 of these individuals did manage to jump from commercial airliners with parachutes and successfully land on the ground. All of these other copycats, however, were unsuccessful. All of them eventually end up getting caught, except D.B. Cooper. As you might imagine, the hijacking led to a major change in airport security. In 1973, passengers for the first time began to have their baggage screened for explosive and weapons. In 1972, the year after D.B. Cooper's jump, there were 31 hijackings. In 1973, that number had dropped to 2. Boeing also made several alterations to their 727 aircrafts, including installing what has been referred to as the Cooper vane, which prevents the lowering of those back stairs while the plane is in flight. Also, because of the Cooper hijacking, it was mandated that a peephole had to be installed in the cockpit doors, because when Cooper jumped from the plane, all of the personnel were in the cockpit. No one saw him jump, so the crew really had no idea what was happening behind them on the flight. Over the years, there have been many intriguing suspects in the case, and we'll go through a few of them here. Of course, the case is still open, so none of these folks have met the FBI's criteria for bringing them in or bringing about charges. The first is a man by the name of Kenneth Christensen, and it was his brother actually who brought him forward to the FBI after his death that he believed he was D.B. Cooper. Christensen enlisted in the Army in 1944 and was trained paratrooper, but by the time he was deployed, the war was essentially over. He did make a few training jumps while stationed in Japan. After leaving the Army, he did join Northwest in 1954 in the South Pacific. Became a mechanic, eventually a flight attendant, and then a purser based in Seattle. He was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking, which fits very closely to the eyewitnesses' guess of his age. However, he was quite a bit shorter, only about 5'8", compared to about the 6 or 6'1" the eyewitnesses had D.B. Cooper at. He was also quite a bit thinner, at about only 150 pounds. He did reportedly purchase a home with cash just a few months after the hijacking in 1971. And while dying of cancer in 1994, he told his brother, "There's something you should know, but I cannot tell you." His brother says he never pressed him for further explanation, but after his death, as family members discovered gold coins, valuable stamp collection, along with over $200,000 in bank accounts, they began to get a little suspicious. They also found he kept a scrapbook of clippings about Northwest that went up about to the time of the hijacking and then stopped. The FBI still stands by its position that Christensen cannot be considered a prime suspect. They cite a poor match to eyewitness physical descriptions, a level of skydiving expertise above that predicted by their suspect profile, and an absence of direct incriminating evidence. Another suspect that has been considered is William Gossett. He was in the Marine Corps, Army, and Air Force. He saw action in Korea and Vietnam. His military experience included advanced jump training and wilderness survival. Gossett was widely known to be obsessed with the Cooper hijacking and had quite a collection of material related to it. Late in his life, he reportedly told 3 of his sons, a retired Utah judge, and a friend of the Salt Lake City Public Defender's Office that he had committed the hijacking. Photos taken of Gossett around 1971 do bear a close resemblance to the most widely circulated Cooper composite drawings provided by the FBI. Some claim that Gossett once showed his sons a key to a Vancouver, British Columbia safe deposit box, which, he claimed, contained the long-missing ransom money. Gossett's oldest son knew his father to be a compulsive gambler who was always strapped for cash, but had showed him wads of cash just before Christmas 1971, weeks after the Cooper hijacking. He speculated that his father had gambled the money away in Vegas. In 1988, Gossett changed his name to Wolfgang and became a Catholic priest, which many have interpreted as an effort to conceal his identity. The FBI has no direct evidence implicating Gossett and can't even reliably put him in the Pacific Northwest at the time of the hijacking. As one agent for the FBI has said, other than statements made by Gossett to someone else, there is really no link to the D.B. Cooper case. One of the most fascinating suspects is a man by the name of Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. He was an Army veteran who served 2 tours in Vietnam, first as a demolition expert and later with the Green Berets as a helicopter pilot. 4 months after D.B. Cooper's hijacking, McCoy staged the best known of the so-called copycat hijackings. He boarded a United Airlines flight in Denver, and brandishing what later proved to be a paperweight resembling a hand grenade and an unloaded handgun, he demanded 4 parachutes and $500,000. After delivery of the money and parachutes at San Francisco International Airport, McCoy ordered the aircraft back into the sky and bailed out over Provo, Utah, leaving behind his handwritten hijacking instructions and his fingerprints on a magazine that he had been reading. Not very careful compared to D.B. Cooper. He was arrested on April 9th with the ransom cash in his possession, and after trial and conviction, received a 75-year sentence. 2 years later, he escaped from the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary with several accomplices by crashing a garbage truck through the main gate. Tracked down 3 months later in Virginia, McCoy was killed in a shootout with FBI agents. While there is no doubt that McCoy committed the Denver hijacking, the FBI does not consider him to be a suspect in the Cooper case despite its similarities because of a significant mismatch in the age of the suspects. There was credible evidence that McCoy was in Las Vegas on the day of the Portland hijacking and at home in Utah the day after Thanksgiving dinner with his family. Our next suspect is Duane Weber. Duane Weber was a World War II Army veteran who served time in at least 6 prisons from 1945 to 1968 for burglary and forgery. 3 days before he died in 1995, Weber told his wife, I am Dan Cooper. Now, the name really meant nothing to her, but when she went to the local library and began to investigate this rather cryptic message her dying husband had told her, she discovered the D.B. Cooper case. In retrospect, she recalled that Cooper once had a nightmare in which he talked in his sleep about jumping from a plane, leaving his fingerprints on the aft stairs. He also reportedly told her about an old knee injury that had been incurred by jumping out of a plane. Other circumstantial evidence includes a 1971 trip to Seattle and the Columbia River, during which Weber walked the area where the bundles of cash were later discovered. The FBI eliminated Weber as an active suspect in July 1998, when his fingerprints did not match any of those taken from the aircraft, and no other direct evidence could be found to implicate him. Later, his DNA also failed to match the samples recovered from Cooper's tie. Though the FBI has since conceded, they cannot be certain that the organic material on the tie came from Cooper himself. And those are just a few of the suspects that have been considered by the FBI or other investigators. If you go onto any D.B. Cooper website, you will find a much more extensive list of other people who have claimed to have been or claimed to have known who D.B. Cooper actually was. A side note in the case is that the man who owned the skydiving school that furnished the 4 parachutes given to Cooper was found dead in his home in a suburb of Seattle in 2013. His death was ruled a homicide due to blunt force trauma to the head. The perpetrator remains unknown. Conspiracy theorists immediately began pointing out possible links to the Cooper case, but authorities responded they have no reason to believe any such link exists. Officials later announced that the most likely motive for the crime was simple burglary. What is so compelling about the D.B. Cooper hijacking is simply the mystery. How is it possible his parachutes have not been discovered? How is it possible he or his remains have not been discovered? How is it possible that 99% of the money involved has never been found, despite extensive ground and air searches and a notoriety that breeds enthusiasts to go out searching in the woods by themselves? It seems like the perfect crime was committed. No one was hurt, and close to $1 million in today's currency was taken by one man. With the FBI effectively closing the case, it seems we may never get answers of what happened November 24th, 1971. However, if you find yourself in Washington State, along the Columbia River, keep your eyes open, as you never know, you may find the next piece of evidence in the D.B. Cooper mystery. Thank you for joining us for today's show. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. It's quite a tale, and I do say, if you want to find out more information about D.B. Cooper, there's a lot more to the story we don't have time to get into today, but it is extremely fascinating. I always love to hear from our listeners, so if you have any show ideas or comments or just want to say hello, feel free to shoot me an email, jim@hauntedwalk.com. And just a quick reminder, you can find all the information about the different tours we're running this summer on our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.